Hey, what's up guys? It's Seb from Workbench, and this week we're going to take a look at doing a city reveal with particles.
A few weeks ago, I was tasked with creating a digital city. The tricky portion of it was that it had to match existing footage because they wanted to transition from the digital city to the footage. So this week we're going to do a little tracking, a little particle work, and at the very end we're going to drop in a little After Effects. So we got a lot to do, so let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to quickly track the shot to get ourselves a 3D point cloud that we can start building from. So you're going to go into Motion Tracker, and I'm just going to do a full solve. So once you get the base track, we're going to change a few settings in here. Start with, I'm going to resample this. I'm going to change this to like 90. Not very fast, but it gives you a much cleaner track because it's using more of the original image versus a downsampled one. We'll leave this alone, although I definitely want more track points. We're going to set it to 4,000. Then I'm going to 3D solve. I'm going to do full 3D reconstruction. I don't know the camera that this was shot on. So then I'm going to click Run Solve. And that's going to take a minute. Now this should be good enough to get it started. We got some points in the foreground. We got some points on each of these buildings. And we got some points in the background. So now that we have this tracked, we're going to do a couple constraints just to orientate the scene and give us a ground plane and all that stuff. So I'm going to go into objects and I'm going to go down to motion tracker tags, and I'm going to start with a planner constraint tag. You can see it gives you this. I'm going to select it and I'm going to lock it in my screen here, and I'm going to click on this little guy right here so I can do my selection, and I'm going to use this one, and this one. They really just all need to be kind of on the same plane. I'm going to create a plane to make sure that this is correct. I'm just going to scrub through real quick to make sure that it doesn't float. And as you can see, we are good. I'm going to make this plane bigger. This will be good for our ground plane. I'm going to do another constraint. I'm going to do a position constraint. Now this is basically orientates your scene. So pick something that is somewhat centralized. I'm going to use probably this one right here. Okay, so that's our center orientation. And then I'm going to do one last constraint. I'm going to do a vector constraint. It's under tags, motion tracker tags, and vector constraint. And then I'm going to set the axes to Z, and I'm going to select these 2 points right here. You can see now our center point is here, our x-axis is running along that, and our z-axis is running along this. So that gets our camera set up. Now we can start building parts of the scene that we're going to want to have our grid on. I think mostly we're going to mainly do this building, these taller buildings out here. Now that we have our 3D track and our scene calibrated, we can start building. For what I'm doing, the buildings don't need to be complicated, so I'm going to go onto the web and download a 3D representation of our city. And let me show you how to do that. I went to the internet and I went to a website called OpenStreetMap, and I looked for the area that this shot was shot in. Luckily for me, it's local, so I know where it is. It's in downtown Tampa. So I went in and I got the area that I needed. I clicked export, and what this gives you is an OSM. So you need another piece of software called OSM to World, and that's a free Java program that essentially lets you convert that OSM data into an OBJ. So you go to File, Open your OSM, and this is what you'll get. You can see it's 3D data representation of the particular area. You can see here's the round building, here's our parking garage, it's kind of funky, and there's the buildings in the background. So we're going to take this and we're going to export an OBJ. And this takes a minute to export because it's got to create all the geometry. File, open. So here's our OBJ here, OBJ import. Now this model is going to be very dense. It's going to have a lot of geo in it. So we're going to clean it up by getting rid of a lot of bits that we're not going to use. So you can see how incredibly slow this is. So we're going to start cleaning this up. I already went in and I deleted some stuff, but I kind of wanted to show you a quick way to select certain objects. So in our case, we know that we're not going to use any of these roads. So I'm going to go in and select them all. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to type in road. Click on this little magnifying glass and type in road. Now here are all our roads. You can see it's just showing you every single road that's in here. We don't need any of them. For us, I'm just going to delete them. Look how much lighter this model is now. It actually moves. So there's a few other things like this, I think is a train track. Yeah, it's called rail. So I'm going to get rid of anything that's called rail in the same method. Give me all of this, and I'm going to get rid of all the rail stuff. Back out, make sure. Yep. Okay, we dump all of that stuff. Select all of that, and I'm going to delete it. So now we're getting a much cleaner thing here. We have buildings and the waterfront. Now there's two things to note. Number one, this does not do elevations. So if you look, the city is built completely flat. You're going to have to play with things in the distance being at the right heights, but it shouldn't matter for our purposes. Now the other thing that I'm noticing is I should have some stuff out here, but really I'm most concerned with these buildings in the front. So that shouldn't be an issue. All right, I think that's good enough cleanup. So here's our city in our scene. Now you can tell this is way wonky. Number one, we need to turn it around. This round building here is this round building here. So you can see that we're not at the right scale. The river's a different size, so we need to scale this entire model up until we get relatively close. We can always fudge things once we get close. I'm getting a little bit of floating here on all this stuff. So you can see this building's points are floating and this building's points are floating. The reason for that is if I look in the top view, you can see the corner represents this corner here. So it's not even close. So we're going to take this and we're going to move it to where it should be, right there. And if I look now, front one should not float, which it does not. It's not lined up per se, but it doesn't float. So once I finished lining it up, the first thing I did was I mapped out the camera move. You can see here I made a spline to give me a guide as to where my camera view is. And then I went in and I removed all the buildings down outside this red area. Then I went in and added a little bit of detail to some of these foreground buildings, as you can see. And then I made sure that the placement was good on those so that when the camera moves, they line up. The next step is going to be to join these buildings together. For what we're doing, it's easier to just have one object. So I'm going to start by joining these buildings together. Once we have everything selected, we'll go right click, select children, and then we'll right click again and do connect objects and delete. So now what we have here is a single object of just the city buildings. And you can see it's got a bunch of shaders. For our purposes right now, we can dump all of these. We also don't need any of these selection tags, so we're going to get rid of those as well. Note, when you do this, you cannot have one of these turned on because what will happen is it'll delete everything. So just make sure that you don't have one selected that is like that. If you right click and do connect objects and delete, you've got your ground plane now. So the next step, now that we've created these separate pieces, getting ready to build particles. We're going to save this off. And I'm going to take these piece by piece. So I'm going to start off by creating just the buildings. So I'm going to turn everything else off. And at this point, I don't need to see this background anymore, so I'm going to turn that guy off too. I want to do my reveal from left to right with a camera animation. I start off by creating an XP system, which gives me an emitter. And I know that that's going to be my building, so I'm going to rename this building edges. And I'm just going to make a copy of the buildings and stick it inside my other objects. I'm going to hide this one. So in my emitter, I'm going to set it to object, and I'm going to set it to edges. And I'm going to grab my building here and make that the object. And I want the particles to stick to the object, and I'm going to go to emission, and I'm going to turn off speed. I'm going to go into shader, and I'm just going to create a basic XParticles material. We don't need to be fancy with our rendering on this. So essentially, you can see this is really ugly, but this is exactly what we want to do. I'm going to increase the amount to 200,000. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. All right, so I definitely want these particles to be smaller. I'm going to go down to 1 on my thing, and I'm going to give it a little variation of 0.5. In the shader itself, we can adjust the size. We can take our particle radius down. Let's take it down to like 20%. Yeah, like that. You can see you're getting the shapes without actually seeing the shapes. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to make it a matte object. If I go into Cinema 4D tags, compositing tag, and then we are going to just make it a matte object. So when it renders out, that's what you get. So you can't see the buildings behind the other buildings. You can see we're already starting to get a cool look here. Now for this also, I'm going to change this from rate to shot. So now that we're happy with the look, we need to set this up so that it can be revealed. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to use groups to reveal this. So I'm going to start off by telling this to go into a group, and I'm going to make that group red. So I can verify that it's going into that group. And I'm going to create another dummy group, and I'm going to make that green. So I'm going to use XP change group modifier, and I'm going to make the settings. I'm going to use color and radius, and the new group is going to be this particle group 2, and the groups to change is going to be this one. But what we're going to do is use a fall off. I think for right now we're going to use a linear field. I'm just going to take this linear field and animate it probably from here. Yeah, let's just animate all the way across and like make it 15 frames. So you can see it's revealing the particles, or rather changing them from one group to the other. So then we just need to take our radius in group 1 and make it 0. When it's red, you can see it's invisible, and when it's green, they're visible. Alright, so that's the first part of the effect. And as we've done in the past, I don't love to do things that are perfectly uniform, so I'm going to add a random field. I'm going to scale it up. You can see here, and then I made the random field, I put it at the bottom, and I made my linear field on add. So when it reveals, you see the holes in here are part of the reveal now. And that's going to be a little more apparent, I think, when we do the faces of these objects. But for right now, that's how we're doing that. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to duplicate the edges and create the faces. I'm going to turn this system off, and I'm going to this system and call this faces. So the only thing we're going to do different here is we're going to change this from edges to polygon area, and we're going to animate this. Let me take a look. Kind of see we're filling in the objects. I kind of like it like random like this, but if you wanted to, you could go in and make it polycenter. So this is what happens when you do polycenter. You get much more uniform, but our model is not set up to do that. When I did this for the project, my client actually came back and said that they wanted more of a uniform feel to the polys. So here are my models. So essentially what I did was I went into MoGraph and I created a matrix object, stuck my buildings in the Verneuil fracture, and then I'm going to delete this point generator. And I'm going to grab my matrix object. It's going to take a second. So to speed this up, I created hollow object, which makes this a heck of a lot faster because it doesn't have to calculate the inside cuts. I'm happy with that. So once you do that, you can just hit current state to object. And what it's going to do is it's going to give you a boatload of objects, which we do not need. Select children, connect objects, and delete. I'll grab that and copy that back in. So you can see now we have our objects set up with more cuts in them. I think this is going to look really nice. So we just have to go back into our emitter, make this the object, and I'm going to do a quick save. I'm going to hit play, and it's going to take a second to calculate frame 1 because it has to calculate one particle per face, and then it'll play back. And now we can render it and take a look. You can see now you have a much more uniform look, which I think is kind of neat. I think probably also for this, I'm going to make these particles smaller. Currently my radius is 1. I'm going to make them 0.25. There you go. That's kind of a nice look to it. So we've already set up the edges and the faces. So now the only thing left to do is to set up the rest of the scene and render it out. So now that we have our faces and edges set up, I think we'll do the same setup for the ground plane. Although I think for the ground plane, I might only do edges. Let's take a look at it. I'm going to duplicate the edges for the buildings. Rename it ground. And in here, I'm going to turn this guy off, hide that one. I'm going to change out my buildings for this ground plane. Then in the emitter, change the object. So now if I hit render, you see that's got a really neat look. I think these particles are also too big, so I'm going to make these a little bit smaller. Go into this particle group, and I'm going to go make those 0.14. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, there you go. That's got a nice subtle look to it. So next we're going to do the water. And I want it to feel like it's a flowing river. I'm going to start off by duplicating my edge. It can be the ground edge, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to make a few changes to it. We're going to start off by changing the emitter type to rate. I want a bunch of particles. It's about 200,000 or so. I'm going to change my emission object to the water that we just copied in here. And again, like the other ones, we're going to make the water a matte object so that it doesn't render and it cuts off the particles that are underneath it. And then I'm going to add two modifiers in here. I'm going to add an XP follow surface, drag the water in there under objects, and I'm going to set pull to 100%. And then I'm going to add an XP direction, and I have the direction just flowing so that the particles flow in this direction. And then I did one other thing. Under my particle groups, remember before we had the speed set to 0 because we didn't want it to move. So now I've set it to 150 with a 50 cm variation. And I did that for both particle groups. So now if I play that back, you can see particles are flowing down the river. And we'll take a look at the render. It might be a bit much, actually. I'm going to cut down the particles by like half. So I'm going to go in here under emission, and instead of 200,000, let's go down to 50,000. Yeah, it's feeling a little better. I think the speed might be a little high too. I'm going to knock this back from 150 down to 75. Still keep the variation of 50. So let's render this out and put it all together. Now in my case, I rendered all of this out in one pass, and I just tweaked it a little bit in After Effects. But let me show you the basic setup. I went in here and I changed my color to random from gradient, and I chose some workbenchy colors. And then I made the size 20% with a variation of 2, and I'm using that shader for everything. And then I went into my X particles setup, and under blend I have it set to add. And what that does is when there's particles on top of each other, you'll get like they'll get brighter. I have adaptive turned on. Then in my other render settings, I have under save, I have alpha channel turned on, and I have straight alpha. And I'm going to do PNGs. So now we can go back and turn all this stuff on and hit render. I'll see you guys in After Effects. So I brought in my image sequence, and I added a tint to it, and I tinted it somewhat black. And then I brought in my particles. So I pre-comped my particles, and I'll tell you why in a second. But in here, I made a glow. It's nothing fancy. I just got 3 different glows. One that gives it this halo effect, one that brightens the actual particles, and one intermediate. So this is what it looks like when it comes in. And then I progressively just add this glow, then this glow, then that glow. And then I also created this matte in Cinema, and I'll show you how I did that. But it's just a matte to add a little bit of glow as the particles disappear. See, this is what it does. And then I have that added to my particles. And at the end, I just have it dissolve away. So when I took that particle layer and I have that just adding on top, I have my full color downtown, and I'm just taking that and I'm dissolving that up over the top of my black and white version. So you can see that's the full effect right there. Let me really quickly show you how I created that matte. Here's the matte, and this is how I created it. So I went in and I created a shader that just has luminance, and it's a Fresnel, and I have it cranked like this. And then I took my water, my ground, and my building, and I put a null object, and I put a poly effects on that. And then I created a plane effector, and inside that plane effector, I have a box field and a random field, and it's the same setup as before. I have the random set to overlay, and I have the box field set to normal. And this animation is happening from 13 to 34. And there's one more thing. So the box is animating across, but the other thing I did inside the box is I changed the contour to step. so that it completely falls off. So it gives you that steppy feel, almost like if it's like growing inorganically or something. And that's about it for that mat. I just hit render and brought it into After Effects. And then in After Effects, I threw it into my particle comp. I added the same glows that I had on my particles, and then I have it set to add, and I shifted it down a little bit because I wanted it to animate a little later. And it didn't matter to me that it doesn't exactly match up to the camera move. It's just off, but you don't notice it at all. So that's about it for this week. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. If you have any comments or questions, leave in the comments down below. And if you'd like to help support what we do, go to patreon.com/workbench. And don't forget to check out the blog at workbench.tv. I'm Sev, and we will see you next week.